Well, I think we can go ahead and get started. Again, I want to thank everyone who has joined us this evening for this project 7th and Greenview water main replacement and resurfacing. Um, this session tonight is going to be it's going to start as informational, so we have a few slides here to give you an overview of the project scope. Jane Allen, the project manager, will be starting with those slides, and then we'll be turning it over to Cyrus here to discuss some of the possible design solutions. And then we're going to wrap up here with a question and answer. We did see for those of you that have taken the survey that you have already submitted some questions. So we have some of those available that we will go over at the end, but then we will also open it up. Again, for those of you who have attended, like I mentioned, you can either submit a question through that feature at the bottom Q&A, or you can raise your hand at the end for a question. But we won't get to that until the end. Hopefully we'll be answering some of your questions during the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jane to start with the first few slides.
Thank you, Michelle.
So Cyrus, can we go to the next slide?
Just as Michelle was saying, that is a little bit of agenda for today. Our meeting here on a Tuesday, starting at 6. It's an electronic Zoom meeting, virtual information session. So we've welcomed everyone. We'll do the project overview for about 10 minutes. Then Cyrus will take it away with active transportation improvements. We'll have a Q&A for the remainder of the time. So we'll run right up till 7 o'clock. And I just wanted to mention now, and we'll mention that again at the end, that the survey for this project, the survey link that's on the website, is not going to close until the 20th. So that gives you a week to change your answers, create a profile, register for the open city hall. So you've got a week, and I hope we give you all the answers that you need to fulfill that and submit that survey. Thank you. Next slide. So the project location is along Greenview between Sile Church and South 7th Street, and along South 7th Street between the Sile Church Service Drive and the Lawton School Elementary approaches. Next slide, please. The scope of the project, there'll be features of infrastructure improvements for water main replacement, stormwater management. We'll resurface the entire road. And then there are some active transportation features that we'd like to incorporate. Active transportation means you're moving your body. So you're a pedestrian, you're a cyclist, you're doing something that doesn't include having a motor. All right, next slide. So the drinking water infrastructure, the key points on why we would replace this, on Greenview, we're replacing an existing small 6-inch line, and we're giving it a new ductile iron 8-inch line. Along South 7th Street, there is a 12-inch line, but due to the cost of maintenance, past breaks, and the capacity of the interior of the pipe, we are installing a brand new 12-inch ductile iron water main on the other side of the street. We would replace water main either for their age, their size, as I explained for Greenview, the cost of maintenance. If we can maintain a system with less frequency, then it grows in value. We also have a need for hydrant coverage. In the past, the coverage might have been over 450 feet. New regulations show that it should be under 300. So we have to put hydrants closer together to make sure our fire department has the coverage they need during a fire event. When you replace water main, you also have opportunities for other infrastructure improvements. In this case, stormwater improvements. Next slide. So the stormwater infrastructure, the opportunities that are provided by us breaking into the road and having to resurface it anyway are some infiltration trenches. We can place them over the proposed water main and also in place of the abandoned water main, which we will actually take out since it's an existing 12-inch. So we will infiltrate on the first runoff through a sand trench. Then we will retain the water in an aggregate trench that will then discharge to the existing storm sewer when the flow in the storm system has gone down. So it holds the water that is in the roadway and it flushes the first runoff. We can also, at the time of this project, repair any damaged structures and sewer that we come across. And we can extra capture rainwater also. We are proposing bump outs at proposed new cross sections across walks. The crosswalks themselves are not a point that we will change in our design. We do want to put the crosswalks at those locations. With the bump outs, not only is it safe for pedestrians and the traveling public, but it also captures rainwater that we can infiltrate into our storm system. Next slide, please. The transportation infrastructure, it's how you want to move in your community, how you currently move. We've asked a few questions like that on the survey about how you use it now and how do you want to use it. The active transportation infrastructure that we provide is like for pedestrians, we use sidewalks, the cross walks, the cross pathways, HMA pathways, the border trail, that sort of thing. And also we want to maintain our bike system. So South 7th Street was designated an all ages and abilities route. And what you can do with that for the cyclist, Cyrus will explain in more detail. But for the transportation infrastructure, not only is it people walking to the schools or the nature areas and the parks in the area, but they're getting around the neighborhood. They're getting out to South Church Road. They're taking mass transit to local businesses. They're getting downtown, and eventually they can get anywhere in Ann Arbor they want to once we improve our infrastructure for active transportation. Next slide. As I was stating earlier, this all ages and abilities bike network, that's along South 7th. It's in our transportation plan. It affords for all different range of cyclists, whether they be children, seniors, people of color, women, people with bike sharing group, low income riders, people with disabilities, people moving goods and hardware, or even confident cyclists. It's this wide range of users that we want to have access not only to use the facilities but get to the facilities. So we want this next slide, Cyrus. We want it to be safe, next, comfortable, and equitable for all users. Next slide. You can read more about the All Ages and Abilities Network for the bicycle network in our Ann Arbor Moving Together, which is in the Comprehensive Transportation Plan. And you can find that online. So considering that this is an All Ages and Abilities Network for the bicycle, once we put in the water main, we improve the storm drainage and we resurface the road. What's on top, before not changing the location of the curbs other than possible bump outs, is the pavement markings that go down. And they can have streets looking many different ways. So Cyrus is going to go through what you have now and different possibilities of what could be.
Okay, I'm going to try and speak up. So if there's any issues, I'll.
I can hear you really well.
Great. I know Michelle is monitoring the chat and Q&A, so if there's anything that comes through, Michelle, please just let me know. So just to reiterate the project location, even though 7th and Greenview are part of the overall infrastructure improvements, 7th Street is the only location in this project that's been designated all ages and abilities, as Ian said. So we'll be, the next few slides are going to be focusing on how South 7th will look, because Greenview will not really look any different based on that type of infrastructure change. So just as a baseline, we put together a cross section of what South 7th looks right now. So going from left to right across the screen, you have sidewalk, parking lane, and then a southbound travel lane. You can see there's bicyclists and cars together, just meaning that it's mixed. There's no pavement markings to indicate any sort of separation. And then the same thing kind of on the opposite side, a northbound travel lane that's shared, unmarked, and then a curbside parking lane and sidewalk. As has been noted, in other project materials, especially the survey, South 7th, especially this section, is relatively wide, which means that there's space for all of this. And the vehicle lanes are relatively wide, given the multiple uses it's kind of serving right now. So with that as the existing baseline, the first proposed idea is essentially keeping it as it is, but with pavement markings to clarify those uses. So we'd have a parking lane, and then at about 8.5 feet out, we would actually mark where that parking lane ends with these pavement markings. You can see, I'm sure you've seen them elsewhere in town. We call them parking tees. It kind of delineates space by space where legal spaces exist, where the parking lane ends or begins. So then the shared lane is a shared use space with motorists. You can also see the title Sharo, because that's the terminology for the pavement marking that indicates, that's on the screen. It shows a bike with arrows indicating a shared space with motorists. So that would be a 12.5-foot lane in each direction that's shared between motorists and bicyclists. And another 8.5-foot parking lane on the northbound side and sidewalk. So again, this would sort of be the baseline. This would be essentially putting things back as they currently are, just with pavement markings to clearly, communicate what each part of the road is being used for. The next proposal, and these, for those who've taken the survey, you might notice that there's some correlation between the options we're talking through and the potential, options we suggested on the survey. The next option would be to actually delineate a little bit, separate the uses a little bit. So in this case, if we actually wanted to create a designated bike lane, a separate bike lane in each direction, we would still have room for parking. 7.5 feet is actually a little more standard for our parking widths, even in busier sections of town. So 7.5 feet should be sufficient here, especially given, there's not, the next use over is a bike lane going southbound and then a vehicle lane going southbound. And again, these are all standard widths that we use around town. So a 5-foot bike lane is pretty typical for a one-way standard designated bike lane without any sort of buffer or protection. A 10-foot drive lane is also adequate and very standard. Only in some cases that are designated truck routes or things of that nature that we are sometimes going above 10-foot lanes when we restripe a road. So this designated bike lane option keeps parking on both sides, provides a bike lane in each direction, and maintains the travel lane in each direction, as all the options do. So this is kind of the next, this first proposal, this second proposal is sort of the next step up in terms of potentially, improving our bike infrastructure and separating the uses a little bit while still maintaining parking. So the next option, again, as for those who took a survey might recognize, a buffered bike lane creates more separation between bicyclists and the vehicle lanes. As you can see here, though, it does remove parking along one side. In this case, we put it on the westbound side, along the west curb or the southbound side. I don't necessarily think that's a given that has to be the case. I think there's some design discussion that could occur about which side parking would be removed on. But for illustrative purposes, it is important to note that this option would involve removing parking along one side. So in that extra space that would have been used for parking is instead used for the buffer space. And also the parking lane becomes a little bit wider like it was sort of in the existing baseline scenario. And that for those who are familiar with this, we have this in areas of town. It does create, even though it does create more separation between the bike lanes and vehicle lanes. One thing that it's probably worth noting that we haven't talked about yet, that was talked about in the survey, is the sort of changing nature of 7th Street, even in this project area. So according to the transportation plan, the treatments that we would put on a minor street, like South 7th is further north here, and for the northern section of this project area, that's a little bit different than what we would put on a local street. So a typical local street, we wouldn't do any pavement markings whatsoever. Because South 7th Street, even though within this project area has both road classifications, part of it's a minor street and part of it's a local street, we're rounding up in terms of, at the very least, we'll put pavement markings in, even though, again, that's not something we would typically from a local street. So our sort of baseline proposal is to put pavement markings in just to clarify the uses, even if it's to clarify the uses as they currently are. So that's all. I bring that up just because some of these higher treatments, these higher levels of treatment, are more typical for a minor street or a higher classification rate street. So a buffered street, or as mentioned in the survey, if we were to put separation in, which is pending some policy and equipment changes we would need to make within the city, those are all kind of related to higher classification roads and higher bike facility treatments. I'll just take a second to switch gears and talk about the crosswalks and bump outs. For those familiar, again, these are pretty common around the city. What bump outs do, as you can kind of see here, at the very right side of the screen, that you can see parking and where a no parking sign, is pointed towards the intersection. The parking is legal sort of on the very right side of the screen, and then where the road narrows, where the bump out is, parking is illegal. Parking, the road is narrowed, which to James' point, increases our stormwater capacity, ability to manage stormwater. From a transportation perspective, it increases pedestrian visibility and reduces the crossing distance for anyone crossing. And what's important to note is that when bump outs occur at an intersection like this, while there's not parking legally allowed on this bump out, it's important to note that the way that we typically design our bump outs and the way that we're designing them at most intersections for this project, it's not taking away any parking that's currently legal at the intersection. So like in this case, you know, if we installed this bump out, you know, I think we say 15 feet is the distance from the intersection that you're not legally allowed to park, whether it's signed or not. The bump out stays within that space, and thus there's not as sort of the impact on parking availability. Legal parking availability is you know, essentially minimized or eliminated. So those are some of the reasons we are proposing bump outs, and some of the trade-offs or impacts. I will point out one location where we do expect a parking impact. So if you look at this project, this aerial plan view of the project area. So along 7th Street, along the bottom of the screen, we have bump outs proposed on just the south side by Brayside Place. Again, those bump outs don't impact legal parking. So any parking that's occurring where the bump outs are currently proposed is technically illegal. And again, whether or not the bump outs occur on the south side or not is a bit of a, you know, there's still some potential for that design detail to change. Yes, Jane.
Cyrus, I just wanted to point out this plan view is the orientation of the set of plans that we'll be putting out to bid. So actually north is to your left. So that's the east side of the road.
Yes, thank you. I realized I didn't provide that orientation, so I appreciate that. So yes, at this bottom, you know, the bottom right corner of the screen is the intersection of 7th and Scioto Church. So yeah, I come left across the screen. That first intersection is 7th and Brayside. Similarly, at 7th and Landsway, it's proposed as a one-sided bump out. Again, which side is not entirely set in stone. We're showing something for, you know, conceptual purposes to some extent. But it's a one-sided bump out proposed at each of those locations, which means that there's no impact to parking because, again, these bump outs are occurring at intersections. So the impact to legal parking availability is there's no real parking impact. And then similarly, where 7th and Greenview meet, we are proposing bump outs at all 4 corners of that intersection, given the proximity to the school and the safety benefits of bump outs. That's a lot of the, you know, sort of impetus for doing that. Again, parking impact along any of these 3 locations, whether it's one-sided bump outs or 2 sides, there's no impact to legal parking availability. Now, the one exception on this proposed plan is the mid-block bump out on Greenview. There's, unless signed otherwise, we would sign it as such if we install this mid-block bump out, we would remove some parking to you know, to allow for the bump out to be installed. So parking would be available on either side of the bump out, but parking would not be available, you know, immediately adjacent to the crosswalk. Again, technically not something that should be happening right now, but this is probably the place where we're sort of seeing them. We might see the most parking impact, and in this case, it's, I think, on the range of like 2 spots per side. A potential total impact of 4 parking spaces removed that are currently legally allowed. Just for the, if we, just to summarize the parking impact of installing bump outs. So we sort of took that you know, detour to talk about bump outs because those cross sections we talked about for the different proposals look a little bit different if we have you know, at each of the bump outs. So for instance, if we were to go with our first proposal, which is pavement markings, clarifying essentially the existing space, if we have shared vehicle lanes in each way, if we have a bump for those locations where we have a single bump out, so like 7th and Landsway or 7th and Brayside, what would happen is parking on one side would not be, as you get close to the bump out, parking would not be allowed there wouldn't be a space for parking on the one side. It'd be the wider sidewalk because of the bump out. Meanwhile, the rest of the road footprint is the same. There's the same width for vehicle lanes in each direction and the same width for the opposite parking lane. For the next proposal, if we had a single bump out in our designated bike lane scenario, again, the impact would be that the bump out would take one of the parking, one side of parking out for the extent of the bump out. And again, the actual impact on legal parking is really eliminated because they're not parking at the intersection of that. That's legally allowed. And then likewise for the buffered bike lane, because the buffered bike lane scenario only had parking on one side to begin with, that one side of parking would be removed to make way for the bump out. So that means that at the going through the bump out, the cross section in this scenario would be no parking on either side. So for those locations like 7th and Greenview, or really, I guess just 7th and Greenview, because the only other location where we propose 2 bump outs is along Greenview. And as we noted, none of these cross sections refer to Greenview. So if at 7th and Greenview, under the baseline scenario where we have shared use space, again, as you might expect, it's sort of the next sort of step up that you'd expect common sense wise. Parking was removed on one side for one bump out. Parking is removed on both sides when we have 2 bump outs. So there's space for both vehicle lanes and shared space for bikes. One concern we've heard in other locations, and this will probably be made clear on the next slide, but there is space for bike lanes for vehicles to be traveling in opposite directions and for bicyclists to also be traveling in the opposite direction. So I think that's going to be even clearer here, like for the designated bike lane scenario where we have a separate bike lane, even at our narrowest point where there's 2 bump outs, there's not parking available, but there is still space. The bump out is still wide enough to allow for bikes to travel in each direction and for cars to travel in each direction. That's one concern we heard in the survey and at other locations where we've installed bump outs. So I just want to make clear that the bump outs are not narrow enough to for these to all sort of be there's still space for all of these to exist separately through the bump out. And then for the buffered bike lane scenario, one thing that's notable is that the cross section, for all of these is at where there's 2 bump outs, that cross section width is essentially the same. So that means that for our buffered bike lane, where there was previously a buffer of several feet, I think 3 feet in each direction, that buffer narrows to the point where it becomes a standard bike lane through the bump out. So, and that's been a practice we've used in other locations. I know on Pauline, there's buffered bike lanes that are buffered throughout most of the corridor. Where there's a bump out, the buffer narrows down to become a standard bike lane through the bump out. Then when the bump out ends on the other side, the buffer begins again. So just to note that in all these scenarios, there's space for different travel modes and different directions of travel to all happen at once. And I'll toss it back to Jane to finish up, I guess. You're on mute, Jane.
I'm sorry about that. The input opportunities you have for this project, and I did notice in the Q&A, someone commented that we've already made decisions and therefore why are we asking for your input? That is not true. We do want to put in crosswalks at intersections in reference to if we have a bump out or if we remove parking. That's all information that we can gather from you tonight. through the survey questions that there were spaces where you could just answer a question, but you could also add comments. And Michelle has compiled those. She will continue to do so until the survey ends on the 20th. So that gives you a week to kind of absorb this information that we gave you, and also come back to the website. We'll have it posted, it's recorded. Your feedback will be used primarily within the internal team staff, including transportation engineers, design engineers, project engineers. We will come together and we will, listen and read all the feedback that we've gotten, the questions that we've gotten, make sure we get answers to those questions. That will be a frequently asked questions document that we'll put on the website. After we compile everyone's questions, we will come up with the answers. We'll put that on the website. As far as your comments, we'll try to incorporate those in future design changes. There are things that we are currently, the plans are, as Cyrus indicated, the use of the space, the footprint is the same, the curbs are not relocating, and the use of the space is the same. Currently, people use the full width of South 7th, the 42 feet to park on both sides of the street, to drive in both directions, and also to bike. So we are trying to come up with some active transportation improvements that make all those safer and more accessible to everyone in the community. And then after Michelle asked a few of the questions that were in the survey question comments, we'll have the virtual Q&A, and we will take your questions live, try to answer as best as we can. There's myself, the project engineer, Cyrus, transportation engineer, and I do believe the city engineer is in the audience.
Yes, in fact, I'm gonna make Nick a panelist as well, so he can answer questions if needed. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So I think that takes us to Q&A. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't have I just got a couple questions that came in. So I'm gonna read these out for the engineers to answer. Can you potentially add permanent snow posts or stakes around the bump out to prevent people from driving over them in the winter? Is that, needless to say, Braeside isn't a high priority for plowing?
Yes, it is common practice for us to install vertical posts next to where bump outs are located as an indicator to everyone, but especially to our snowplow drivers about where the curb lines are. So that would be installed as part of any bump outs that are installed.
Okay, great. Another question that just came in is, wouldn't it be safer to reduce the speed limit down to 10 or 15 miles per hour than to do the bump outs?
So there's a few elements to that question. I guess the first is that just to establish as a baseline, 7th and Greenview currently have our lowest speed limit in the city, which is 25 miles an hour. The only place that's lower than that are our school zones, which is only applicable during school hours. Those are 20 miles an hour. So it's so we wouldn't, as a matter of practice, bring a speed limit in general that low. That being said, if the speed limit were too high and we wanted to consider changing it, what's been sort of established in sort of traffic and transportation studies is that speed limits on their own and signage on their own can have an impact on speeds, but usually a much more marginal impact than is sometimes thought. So if we, for instance, changed it to 25, if we wanted to change the speed limit and had the legal ability to do it, which as I noted, we don't have any speed limits that are lower than 25 that aren't school zones. Just even if we had that legal ability to change it to that low, like 10 or 15, there is sufficient evidence from other studies that just changing the speed limit signage on its own without any design changes like bump outs or other design changes that help sort of slow traffic through behavior and design changes, that on its own, the speed limit and signage change would not likely have as big an impact as we would like to on safety.
And I would also like to point out that these bump outs, they're not primarily being installed or proposed to slow the traffic, because the lane width that we're going to have through the bump out, as low as 10 feet wide, that will be the lane width for that lane for the entirety of the project limits. So it's going to make you go slow throughout the entire project, not just through the bump outs, because you're going to feel tighter to your neighbor that you're driving forward to. But the other benefits of bump outs is that that pervious surface area that we're adding, we're putting grass in where currently there is pavement. And also, most importantly, is the pedestrian improvements that we are giving, because we are putting pedestrians in a crosswalk closer to the view of the traveling public. They're not hiding behind a parked car. They're coming out full view. They can see the drivers can see them. It's also, decreasing the distance of the crosswalk, therefore allowing the time being spent in a traveled zone to become less.
Okay. We do have one hand up, so I'm going to um, unmute Donald, and then I will go back to the questions that have been submitted.
Thanks. Donnell White. I'm a resident on Scioto Church. And I have a few questions, but I'll just limit it to maybe two, and then I'll put the other ones in the Q&A just to make space for others. One of the things that is striking to me as you do this presentation is all the attention seems to be focused on preserving car parking lanes and not opening the road to more uses instead of just cars. And I was surprised that in the presentation, there wasn't an example of a raised bike lane. And I wondered if there was a decision that the city has made to reject a raised bike lane option for this project. And I asked that question because I bike with my kids from Scioto Church to 7th to Lawton. We do that daily. Our kids are in 3rd and 5th grade. They would be in any other environment that had a protected bike lane, safe to do that on their own. But my wife and I don't feel safe sending our kids to bike to school. And just this week, as we were biking at the top of 7th, as it intersects with Scioto Church in the pedestrian island, because you all have the bump outs there, we had a delivery truck that almost ran us over. And so the idea that we have an opportunity to put in a protected bike lane with a vertical protection here or a raised bed, and we're not taking that, just feels like we're giving all of the attention to cars, and that the cars are the uses of this road. That's the only use, and everything else is just an annoyance of some sort. So if you could just help me as a resident understand, like, what do we mean when we say all ages and abilities? Does that include my 3rd grader? Should she be able to bike safely to school? Or is that not a part of what we're interested in doing?
No, there
Thank
is,
you.
and that's why we asked the question in the survey, because the vertical elements, we had not considered a raised bicycle lane because of the cost involved, and also because of our fear that the residents out there do value their on-street parking. So what we have come up with as a current design is just the same uses that are out there. And then we take this survey and we hope people, value the safety and the cycle network and the pedestrian network and the sidewalk network that we have provided. So we are hoping that The residents will go for the, the safest version of our efforts, which would be that buffered bike lane. And that would have to take out parking on at least one side of the street. Now, the code shows that if you eliminate on-street parking for more than one block, it has to go to city council for approval. So we would propose a resolution to that effect to eliminate on-street parking. That would go to the Transportation Commission. They would endorse or not endorse it, and then it would become on a city council agenda, and they would take all the information and feedback that we provide them, and speak to their constituents, find out, the voice of the people in this community, what the community at large would want, what adjacent property owners would want, and then they have to make a decision of whether they eliminate the on-street parking. In some scenarios that Cyrus was showing you, we cannot install, we cannot install a buffer bike lane on both lanes without at least taking one lane of traffic out. And as you saw too, if we take out both lanes of on-street parking, the buffered bike lane still has to become a designated bike lane through the bump out. But in the future, and I think that Cyrus or Nick could probably attest to this, but I think that we now have the equipment to plow local roads that have designated and buffer bike lanes. In the past, we didn't have equipment narrow enough to get in between bollards or vertical separators. So our goal in the future, now that we have the equipment, we would install bollards if we had a buffer bike lane. Those bollards then are a vertical element to the network that would prevent cars from even entering the bike lane. I hope I answered your question.
I'm gonna add just for a minute on top of that, Jane, if that's all right. I know we have a lot of questions. I don't want to spend too much on any one question, but the one thing I'll say, yeah, Jane is correct that the city is working towards equipment for that purpose. I don't believe we have it in hand yet, but we're actively working on that type of maintenance concern for locations where we might be able to add vertical protection, especially where a buffer, placing it in where an existing buffer would be. So if we went with the buffered bike lane option here, we could then install vertical elements, and once we have that equipment, we'd be able to maintain and plow and sweep with a little bit more ease. Getting to your, I think how you originally framed it, I just want to clarify that South 7th again is a combination of a local and a minor street, and according to our transportation plan, that means that basically the level of how much vehicle traffic it sees and the speed of traffic and things like that sort of help with visualizing what classification the street is in and what type of bike treatment would go in as a result. But because 7th Street isn't sort of a larger road that has heavy vehicle traffic, that has very heavy speeds, very fast speeds, the treatments are sort of in proportion as a result. So yeah, there's not really, if we were to install a raised, separated bike lane similar to something you might see downtown on 7th Street, that's a little bit out of proportion with the design of what a street, what the classification of 7th Street kind of is, like the level of traffic and the level of and the speed. But I certainly understand and appreciate that concern. I think the overall idea is that we certainly want to make it as safe as we can, and while balancing the trade-offs we've heard from everyone about what level of treatment is really appropriate. So.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question that maybe it's somewhat related. How many feet do the bump outs extend into the road?
I mean, without having the plans in front of me, I'll just go back to.
They would be at least as wide as a parking lane.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say is we don't have a slide where they're back to back, but like this very first one, you can see there's, again, if this was just using the same space, just marked clearly, there's one parking space removed and all the other parts of the road are the same. So it's,
Mm-hmm.
you know, somewhere in that 7-8 foot for each side of a bump out would be about how much it extends into the road on each side.
Okay.
And I did want to point out, since you're on that slide, Cyrus, that you had mentioned that the on-street parking markings are a bit wider here than they are on the other spaces for the bikes. If it's a designated bike lane or a buffer bike lane, the parking goes down to its normal 7.5 feet width. The reason that this is wider, not only is it to keep people from parking on the curb if they're uncomfortable doing that, but also it was to narrow the lanes, because as I said, once the lanes get down to 10, it becomes uncomfortable to go very fast. That's what all the streets downtown are, 10 feet wide. Currently, even with 8-foot parking lane, the lanes that are left are 15 feet wide. That would cause a lot of people to speed. So at least when we put in the pavement markings on this particular cross section, we are narrowing the lanes.
Okay. The next question we have here is, why is it necessary to completely shut 7th and Delaware during the construction rather than allowing traffic in one direction or another?
Jane, you're on mute.
Could you repeat that, Michelle?
Why is it necessary to completely shut down 7th and Delaware during the construction rather than allowing traffic in one direction or another?
It's going to be shut down to local traffic. I mean, it's only going to be open to local traffic. So there is going to be a detour south. South Church is not going to be constructed now until next year. So that's going to be going on at the same time this job is going on. So we're going to have you detoured. So you're just further east of 7th Street to enter onto South Church Street. So that's what the detour is about. But everyone will have access. It will be local traffic only. So it will be closed to people who don't live on that street. We are going to be keeping Greenview open so you can get to the school for the duration of the school being open. So we won't start Greenview until the school's closed for the summer.
Okay, so I think that helps answer this question, which is when Lawton is letting out, there are long lines of traffic between Delaware and Greenview as parents are waiting to pick up their kids. What impact will the proposed changes have on this traffic congestion?
As you can see, the bump outs that we propose are at Greenview and South 7th. They don't go any further down South 7th. So we aren't doing any changes to the parking at all along South 7th between Greenview and Delaware. We will be possibly introducing some bike lanes, but it won't affect and it won't improve the existing congestion that's currently there.
Okay. Is there a plan to use pervious pavement materials?
There's not a plan currently.
I can jump in on that real quick too. We've done some projects in the past to evaluate permeable pavement, and it has not worked out very well. It's very hard to maintain the permeability. What we've done instead is we found alternate ways to get stormwater runoff into the ground without having it to go directly through the pavement. So it gets the same result without having the maintenance problem that type of pavement causes.
Okay. I'm going to ask this question because it also came through in the survey. Kind of what data is available, or what evidence is there to show the benefits versus the detriments of bump outs?
Maybe the best place that's on the city's, I mean, all of these treatments in general, the transportation plan is a good resource for talking through individual treatments. Obviously more than what we've talked about here, but but bump out different levels of bike treatments, about sort of the benefits of those. Because bump outs are also part of the city's traffic calming program, the city's traffic calming website would be a good resource for the benefits of bump outs. I think we've talked about them a little bit during this meeting, so rather than
Okay.
go into significant more detail, I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to just maybe put the link then in the chat for people who have detailed questions about that. I'll put the link to where the transportation plan is located. Let's see here. Are there any questions here that the engineers are seeing that we feel like have not been answered? You know, there's a few more questions. So if you use the bike lane marking that have parking only on one side, this will significantly reduce parking for the lot and drop off. Where will the overflow go? There's a lot of questions about the school and parking, but it sounds like you guys have you know, claimed that this shouldn't really have any impact on parking for pickup and drop off at the school. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. It shouldn't change. I'm reading
Yeah,
a few questions myself, and I do see that, you know, it's asked about sidewalks. We will not be changing the location of the curb or the sidewalks. They will remain. And therefore we will not be eliminating any lawn extension. Any stormwater features that we have are going to be within the roadway. The only thing that may come up is if a bump out is adjacent to your property, whether it has concrete or grass, you will be maintaining that either by shoveling or by mowing in the summer. And then the fact that Greenview was not designated all ages and abilities, that will be something that you can find in the transportation plan, I believe. Why some stand out and others didn't. I don't believe the all ages and abilities route is very large, is it, Cyrus? It sort of takes on the bike network.
I mean, some of it has to do with just connectivity. So because Greenview doesn't extend far north and south as 7th, and because 7th does have some existing bike infrastructure north of this location, I think that those kinds of things played into. I'll also just say when it comes to school considerations, we will work with the school. We have worked with the school in the past prior to this project, and we will during and after. There are a lot of elements that are within the school's control. Then there are elements that are within the city's control when it comes to safety and, you know, sort of pick up and drop off operations. So we'll continue to do that during and after this project. But what we found is that our experience is that usually working with the school, we can figure out ways to, you know, to sort of, you know, improve safety and to improve operations for pick up and drop off if we work with the school. There's usually, you know, there's some space on the school property that, and how it's all managed by the school staff are all elements that make a difference that are not just related to neighborhood curb space. So.
Okay, so maybe we have time for one more question, and then as we've mentioned, we are going to be compiling these questions and creating a frequently asked questions section of the project website, which I have put the link in the chat so that you can access that information. Our meeting does go until 7, so we have 1 more minute. So I think maybe we'll take one more question.
Hey, Michelle, I saw that there was a question in here. Somebody said that wanted to know if they could modify their survey after seeing the presentation tonight. I didn't know the answer to that, but I thought we should address it maybe.
I believe you can, because I would gone in there after registering and taking the survey, and it says you log back in and it recognized that you already took the survey, so it says, would you like to change your answers, edit your answers? And then I just wanted to point out, before Michelle asked that last question, you can always call or email me your questions if you haven't been able to get them in tonight or during the survey. We just went dark at the office.
Yeah. Okay, well, I see that Christy has her hand up, but there's also a question submitted, so I'm going to assume that is the question that she has. So let's see here. Why is the option that removes street parking completely even being considered, given that there are two options that preserve all or some street parking and meet the additional safety requirements?
That
Um,
is not being proposed. It would only occur if we did a buffered bike lane through a bump out that was on two sides. So just for that small portion, it'd have to become a designated bike lane, and you wouldn't be able to have parking on either side.
and I guess this is maybe an opportunity to speak to a few different questions that have come in. As Michelle said, we'll post an FAQ after and answer these questions in more detail since we are running out of time. A lot of the questions I think have come in about whether there should be some level of bike facility versus some level of parking. You know, that's part of what the survey is for. That's part of what feedback in this meeting is for. But it's also important to note that those are values questions, and some of that has also been we already have a policy direction on some of those values in the transportation plan that's been adopted. So where possible, we are going to try to maximize safety and maximize, and build out an all ages and abilities network. But that being said, we also understand that people do feel strongly about traveling by and parking by in their vehicles. So we're trying to do this on a project by project basis to get a sense of the community values and what level of design is right for each location. But it is important to note that our default notion is to try to maximize safety with things like bump outs, maximize safety by installing some level of bike facility, ideally, depending on the trade-offs, more robust biking facility rather than less robust. Again, depending on the type of road it is. But those types of questions, we do ask these questions in the survey, and we have these public meetings to try to get a sense of the values that are important for each given project. But the transportation plan does lay a lot of those types of questions out, I think, for us. So.
And a final comment from myself, I said there would not be a situation where both sides of the street would lose their on-street parking. I misspoke, because in the very first block of South 7th Street between Scioto Township, Church Road, and Breeside Place, because of the refuge island that's currently there, we would not be able to change the use of the bike lane, which would be a shared use bike space with motor vehicles, unless we got rid of the on-street parking on both sides. So if the parking is to remain, then the bikes will have to use a shared space with motor vehicles. It's only the scenario that on-street parking would be removed from both sides of the road that we could install a bike lane.
Okay. Well, thank you again for everyone who showed up tonight. Please visit the project website, which is in the chat. In, I would say, about a week or so, we should have a lot of these questions up with responses to them. And again, the survey is open for another week, so you still have another opportunity to share your input with the city. And again, Jane, like she mentioned, the project manager is available if you want to call or email her. That's on the screen right now, her contact information.
And it's also on the website. And another thing that's on the website is a subscription to Gov Delivery. Throughout the process of the design and updates in the schedule of construction, we'll be updating the website. If you sign up for the subscription, I can also send individual updated emails to people on that list. And then during construction, you can opt out of those emails, but people adjacent tend to stay on that email list because I give weekly updates on what the contractor has done that week and what they plan to do in the following week. That is at the bottom of the website, little blue envelope.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.